Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of the BashTalk podcast. Today I've got none other than our own special guest, Asif Ali Shah, all the way from County Durham. Once a Nelsoner, always a Nelsoner, as they say, and I'm sure you can tell us a bit more about that. But Asif, if you could just give us a really quick and brief intro about yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. Born and bred in Nelson. Spent my childhood on Albert Street. Had some many good years there. Then in about 85, moved on to Every Street. 93, moved up to Durham. Headed up this way. Uh, just changed my life. Got married. Uh, got myself a degree in journalism. Started doing what I love, coaching in the boxing, in boxing as well, amateur boxing.
Yeah,
Now working in Her Majesty's Prison Service, believe it or not. And that's about
very
it.
good.
Family man, just keep it quick and brief, Bash.
Okay, and then in terms of your upbringing in Nelson, so I want to lay this and then set this up so we go into your journey into boxing. But you obviously grew up in the 70s in Nelson. Now, the vast majority of my audience are obviously not necessarily in that age group, so I don't think they've got an appreciation for what life was like in those days. But can you just give us just a rough idea, or even just like a bit of insight as to what life was like for you, say, at that young age in the town of Nelson, in terms of race issues, in terms of kind of like poverty, but obviously not poverty, but just a general like affordability of everyday things and stuff like that.
Bash, we were unfortunate in Nelson because on one side you had Burnley, which was a BNP stronghold. Then on the other side you had Corn, which was a National Front stronghold. And I can tell you, when I was growing up, 5, 6, 7, 80 years old, seeing skinheads coming along every street, packy bashing, as they called it back then. Pardon the phrase, but it's a phrase that was used back then. And it was hard. It was very hard. Because our parents weren't fighters. Let's remember that they came here to work to make a
Yeah.
living. It was only when the generation above me started growing up and thought, no, we need to stand against all this. And there was a lot of trouble back then in '70s. We were constantly, called racial names. I remember my father actually nearly being beat up by a skinhead, and I was only 80 years old at the time. And stuff like that affects you, Bash. When you see your father taking racial abuse of people, and that scarred me really bad.
Yeah,
As I
I
got
can
older, then in
imagine.
the
Yeah.
80s, sorry,
I was going to say, I can imagine the kind of impact it would be because you're obviously quite
yeah,
small
uh,
in the
and then
field.
in the 80s, it started getting a bit better because our next generation started taking a firm hold and said, no, we ain't going to tolerate this, because they were born and bred here, and they were not going to take it, not like our parents did. In general, the 70s were hard. Mid 80s were brilliant. Mid 80s was the time to be a youngster in Nelson. Every back street was full of kids playing football. We were all Zicos, we were all Maradonas, we were all Peles, living. And we never had the computers, we never had the money, but there was a lot of unity and a lot of respect within the area. And in the 90s, it stayed the same in the early 90s, but then things have changed now, Bash. You know, Nelson's changed as well in some respects. But for me, Bash, it's always home and always will be.
When you compare, because just for the context for our audience, Asif is obviously based in County Durham, but he does, as he's mentioned before, he spends a lot of time in Nelson too. So he's got his finger on the pulse of before and after, effectively, and he gets the benefit of kind of being on the outside and then having the ability to look at it from unbiased, you could almost say. But what do you think has changed in terms of the compared to the 80s? You reckon it's a little bit rougher, maybe?
For a start, there's a massive drug problem in Nelson. Okay? Years and years ago, if there was a problem, it was always on the perimeters of the town. Yeah? It wasn't brought into the communities, Bash.
Hmm.
And it breaks my heart to say that I don't live there. I don't have the experience. But you hear things, you see the media, you see the news. And it's heartbreaking when stuff like that comes into the community. And back in our day, I can tell you now, I don't say our day as though I'm some sort of OG. I'm just telling you what it was like in the early 80s. We were only kids at the time. If we ever saw anybody walking along the road, maybe it was somebody's mother or a sister, would directly cross over the road. If one person had a cigarette in his hand, he would throw that cigarette on the floor out of respect. Yeah. Everything that went on happened on the outskirts of town. We never brought it to our doorsteps. And now you feel as though in some parts of Nelson, the drug problem is getting worse and worse, and it's within our communities. And I don't wish to upset anybody by making that statement, but it's a fact. And sometimes you have to look at facts and you got to face them head on.
Well, thank you for being just straight to the point about it, because it's just a cold hard reality. It's not something that can be denied. But let's tie that part of the conversation into you making the move to County Durham. Now, in my notes, I made a comparison to the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, saying that you've obviously gone from one end to another. But can you tell us a little bit more about that side of things, please?
Bash, this is a story which I've told countless times. I finished work on Friday. I used to work in a small factory in Loamshire Industrial Estate, Canadian Pizza. It was Friday night. I came home, and the plan was usually Friday night. Friends were waiting in a car. I'd go upstairs, quickly get changed, and we'd go out. I went upstairs into my room. When I opened my bedroom, there was no bed there. There was no wardrobe there. Nothing there. So I comes downstairs, and my mother, Allah Pak Jantanj Kar Dene, may Allah grant her a higher rank in paradise, she was sat on the floor. I said, Mum, where's my bed? Where's my wardrobe? She said, son, you're moving today. Right? This is God's honest truth. So I went outside and I told my friends, and we all had a few tears. And I got in the car and then drove to Durham, and that was it. Because Bash, I believe my mother knew something that I didn't know. She knew that things weren't right. And that's how I moved. I didn't even know about it. I went to my room, and my room's empty. There was no bed. There was no wardrobe. My clothes were all gone. And then my mum said, go and have a look in the back street. And there was a big white van with all my bed, my cupboards, my clothes. Everything was packed. I didn't even get time for a shower, mate. But I never argued with her. I said, Mum, if that's what you've decided, that's what's going to happen. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me in my whole life, brother. And this is why they say, your mothers, when they tell you something, they know something which you may not know at the time. But when you get older, you realize, Mum knew something that I didn't. And she was right.
So it was a good decision in the end then?
Of course it was.
Definitely.
And the beauty of it is, I still never forgot my roots. I still, remembered that I have friends, I have brothers, I have sisters, I have people who I grew up with Nelson. And I still, people say I'm a Nelsoner because I spend more time there than I do up in Durham.
Yeah.
Not so much now with the coronavirus and the lockdown.
But, when...
So there you have it, Bash.
I was going to say, how old were you then?
I was 20 years old.
Wow. Oh man, I can't imagine how difficult it would be, because at that point, you're established, aren't you? So...
Bro, it took me 3 or 4 years. I went through a bit of depression when I moved up here, because you come from one community to the next. To be fair, we come up here, we settled straight in. There was quite a few of us, my 3 brothers. And then, I guess it's because we were westernized. People up here accepted you because they know, they can tell by the way you talk. They can tell by your twang and everything else that, is born and bred here. They treat you a bit differently up here. And it was hard. For 3 or 4 years, I went through depression. I was missing my friends massively. Missing them like mad. Every excuse I found to come down and see them. But
this is the days before the internet was a thing, eh?
Yeah, we did have the old little bit of knock. We're not that old, Bash. Come on.
So tying this, so if we wind it back a little bit, So
Okay.
20, you went to County Durham, but before that, it's back in Nelson. You kind of got into the boxing thing a little bit. You did a bit of training at Chiefy's gym. Is that right?
Chief's gym, yeah, mashallah. May Allah grant him a place in Jannat. He had his gym in Lonsdale Street, I think it was, and Shahid and Arif, if I remember correctly, he was a boxer, and they both opened this gym up there. And we started there. It was a good little gym. It took a lot. It was new. Something like that never happened in our community before. An Asian opening a boxing gym for the lads to go and let out their anger, let out their frustration, because there was a lot of frustration, a lot of anger amongst the youth in the late 80s and early 90s, and it was pretty successful. A lot of kids used to show up.
But what is it that you enjoyed most about it? Because you've clearly gone on to have like a real like affiliation
To be
and
honest with
passion for
you,
the
Bash,
sport.
my love affair with boxing started when I was about 7 or 8 years old. You know, uh, and when I went to Chiefs, started training there, I tried the boxing, and to be honest with you, I was never going to be a good boxer, but I knew I would be a good coach because my mind was telling me what to do, but my body just wasn't doing it. And my love affair with boxing started when I was about 7, 8 years old, watching an old and faded Muhammad Ali. I just sometimes wish I could have been a bit older. Maybe I could have seen him in his prime. And then obviously, late 80s, Mike Tyson came along, and that just, my love affair with the sport got stronger. And I've always looked at the sport from a technical side, Bash.
Mm.
I don't enjoy tear ups that have no technical, like slugging matches.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
rather see a good technical fight than a slugfest. But Lonsdale Street's where it started. I tried it, but I was never going to be that good. So that's when I decided, right, I'll start studying it now a bit deeper, and that's when I started getting into the history of boxing, where it started from, and the technical side. I mean, mashallah, you being a wrestler yourself, you know that technique, the technical side of any sport is the sport, is the aspect of sport that needs to be mastered.
100%.
And there's not enough people now who don't understand the meaning of technicality. And I'm hoping to bring that back into boxing. I do a bit of coaching now and then. I don't need to hold up pads to teach technical stuff in the sport. But there you have it. Like I said, started at Chiefs, and
Yeah,
just the passion grew.
to be honest, because obviously we're not that far apart in age, but I never knew about, there was a little bit of boxing in Nelson like from before, because it's not something I've ever associated with Nelson. And mashallah, it's good that Chief made that facility available. So in terms of your, like you said, you prefer technical side of things. And I think that kind of reflects in why you do get called up and asked a lot of questions about boxing, because generally you do provide a very, very technical insight into that. So with that in mind, let's wind the clock back a bit and let's start, because one of the viewers has a question for you. I'm not going to say who it is, but he wanted to ask you to chronologically go through each generation, starting from the 60s, and break down your favorite fighters and explain why. So if we start from the 60s, who was your guy?
There was quite a few, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
There
yeah,
was there was quite a few. Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint exactly, because like in the early 60s, you had fighters who were fading off from the 50s.
yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah.
And then in the late 60s, you had them who were fading off in there. To be honest with you, when I talk about fighters, for me, Bash, 60s, I'm thinking long and hard about this. What I like my little men, yeah? I like my little men, like who can put up a fight, sort of thing. I'm stuck with that, Bash.
That's fine. That's fine.
And I
So
tell you why.
go on.
There's just too many to choose from. Honest
Okay.
to God, there's just too many to choose from. Like people say the 70s was a golden era, and it was. 60s wasn't much of an era. If you look at the history of boxing,
Mm.
if you'd have said to me, pick some from the 70s, 80s, 90s onwards,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
60s, I don't think there was really, because the likes of the Sugar Ray Leonards and all that, they were like towards the ending, you know what I mean? They weren't in that prime in that decade. The
Yeah, yeah,
decade,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know, 70s goes as a golden era, 90s goes as a golden era, and since the 90s, nothing's happened.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you who
So
asked the
in the
question.
70s, if
Yeah.
I think it's probably Missam.
Yes. Two thumbs up there, man.
Yeah. Do you know, in the thing is, if he looks back at the end of the day, you know, like the 60s was a good era, but for me, I focused on the history side of things, 1900 onwards. And for me, I focus a lot on the 70s era. The 70s era for me was a massive era, the 80s as well, the late 70s, 80s, 90s. And then after the 90s, Bash, everything's just gone flat.
Yeah, it is.
Just gone flat for my liking.
You know because if you're looking at say the styles that they've come through, so you've looked at it historically and you probably watched like all fights as well. What do you think of stylistically is how different is the style of boxing today compared to how it was, say, if you go back up to the 70s? Is there like a massive difference in skill, or is it just a case of just the tactics are changing, I guess, if that makes sense?
You know what it is? Ideally, the sport should be evolving. Ideally, it should be evolving. Training methods were different. You never had all these supplements which they have now, which apparently works. But I'm gonna ask you a question. If you've got a heavyweight champion who boxed in his prime in the 70s and then in the 90s comes and cleans up the division more or less and wins the title, what does that tell you how far the sport's evolved?
Yeah, that's a very fair point.
Yeah, George
Yeah,
Foreman. George Foreman. He was in his prime in the 70s, you know, Olympic, Tweedo, blah, blah, waving the American flag, you know, knocking out the likes of Joe Frazier, beating the likes of Ken Norton in the 70s. But then he comes in the 90s and just blows away. And he goes 12 rounds with Evander Holyfield. No disrespect to Evander Holyfield, none whatsoever. And then you've got the likes of the era we're in now. We're relying on circuses like Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones to keep the sport going.
yeah, yeah.
What's changed? Obviously, the way they do things. And we go back to the fact that boxers aren't technical anymore. They're focusing too much on fitness, going fast and furious, boxing in straight lines. Nobody wants to talk about the technical side. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, in the early eras, it was technical. Boxers, believe it or not, used to go out into the fields and they used to catch flies to work on their reflexes.
Wow.
Yeah. Nowadays, you've got computers, you've got screens, you've got all sorts of these things they put on. So, really, boxers should be better in this era, but they're not.
I like that you mentioned about the going in straight lines. I mean, again, I can't box. I don't pretend to know anything about boxing, but from obviously my sport is a different sport, but there is still some elements that I can spot if I'm watching a boxing match where you can look at the footwork and think, okay, that's this guy's flat-footed. But like then if you look at old footage of Muhammad Ali and the guy's just dancing around the ring, I can't see many heavyweights do anything like that today.
You probably watched the big fights, dear. Well, the
Yeah,
so-called big
yeah,
fights.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
You saw this this Joyce kid the other day.
Yeah, man.
You know, now, well, it's a difficult one, Bash. You know, the question you're asking is because at the end of the day, it's a question which a lot of boxing fans are asking is what's happened? Why has it gone downhill? Why hasn't it evolved with time, Bash?
Mm.
You know, if you look at other sports, cricket, yeah, look how much that's evolved. Look at football, how much football's evolved. Why hasn't boxing evolved? Could it be that we don't have the the right coaches now? Could it be we've changed the whole way? Could it be that coaches aren't training the boxers the way they used to? Is it because they're relying too much on technology rather than using this when it comes to coaching?
What's the
Does that make
situation? Yeah,
sense?
yeah. I was going to say, but what's the situation historically with the way that scoring's done, and judges and the way they tally up the scorecards? Is that the same as it always has been, or?
Do you know what the problem is? Judges nowadays, no disrespect, are that old they can't even see past their noses.
Yeah.
Bash, I'm being serious. Yeah? In the amateur game, when I started teaching in amateur, you had to press this button. Whenever there was a punch, you had 3 seconds to hit this button. And I'm telling you, some of the coaches were probably 80, 75, 60 years old. You're talking about judges, you're also thinking about the fact that they have political ties in the sport as well.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you recently saw the Ritson fight as well.
Missed that
And a
one.
lot of the decisions are going that way because of the political ways of the sport. And this is why against Ritson, I almost walked out on the sport because that was one proper disgusting decision. And he was the Eddie Hearn fighter. So, and it spoils the sport, Bash. It spoils the sport.
I think that's probably the scary bit because like there's even when the Tyson Fury and Wilder when they got that draw, it's like, oh, okay, that's a bit of a weird one. But you probably are more, familiar with that aspect of the judging. Maybe it was justified, but
Tyson won that fight.
yeah,
Tyson won that fight hands down. But in the end, it did him a lot of good because he made a lot of money on the rematch.
yeah,
And the true boxing fan knew who the real heavyweight champion was. And sometimes boxers only want the opinions of the true boxing diehards. They aren't bothered about these belts. If they know that they're the people's champion, it's like when Muhammad Ali was exiled out of the sport. It didn't bother him that much because he knew the public knew that he was still the champion. He didn't lose that belt by getting beat. Same with Tyson Fury. He beat Wilder the first time. And I think the rematch, he went ahead with it because who wouldn't want that sort of money when you're going to get for the rematch?
yeah. And I think it was like a blessing in disguise because he totally just changed his strategy and said, right, I'm just going to knock this guy flat. And he just demolished Wilder, didn't he, the second time round?
Yeah. But like I said, there's a massive, there needs to be done. Something needs to be done. Either we need to change the sport from grassroots up, Bash, or we need to, you have to inject something into it because it's dying.
Okay.
It really is dying.
No, I'd be inclined to agree with you. I mean, it's got to a point where people who are social media celebrities are raking pay-per-view boxing for boxing matches, whereas the real boxers are on like
There you
four
go.
$4,000 undercard payments. So it's like, oh. But I do have a few more questions for you though. I know you are. I just want to state for the
Well,
benefit of the viewers and listeners that Asif is a bit short on time, and we do need to cut off very shortly. He has duties to attend to. But what's the deal with? And this is another question from Mesam, but it's something I'm curious about as well because I've seen a few kind of videos floated about on YouTube. What's the deal with the or your thoughts on the Cuban school of boxing? What is it?
it's like with the communism and all that, that all comes into it as well. There's been some great Cuban amateurs, but it's somewhat to do with communism, to be honest with you. I think, Bash, because I don't really bother with the amateur side of boxing. Yeah, I do know there's communist countries like China, because they're communist. You won't see a Chinese professional. You won't see a Cuban professional.
Yeah.
It's somewhat to do with, I don't know, because like I said, I don't bother with amateur now. I used to coach, but I don't bother with that side of things. But I think it's to do with the communism.
Okay.
I don't know whether they see it as, like something like a capitalism where they make money on people hurting themselves. I'm not too sure how it works.
Okay.
But communism, I'm sure I'm almost certain it's something to do with communism. Because I read somewhere an article a lot of years ago that there are some absolutely brilliant Cuban fighters. And there was one in the 70s, or was it early 80s? He actually, he excelled. He could have turned pro and he was one hell of an amateur. I can't remember his name now. But they were actually saying he was as good as Muhammad Ali if he turned pro. But he didn't turn pro because of the political stance his country had.
Got you.
Something along those lines, but don't quote me on that, Bash.
Okay. So for you personally now, so we've got your thoughts on obviously the state of boxing and stuff like that. What about you coaching wise? Like I believe you've got a relative that did quite well boxing wise, and maybe is still involved in the sport. Are you still coaching in any
Yeah.
capacity, or what's?
What it is, Bash, I coached all of my nephews, from home. and they all got to national level. They became national champions.
Oh,
They did
mashallah.
really, really well.
Well done.
But unfortunately, when they get to 17, 18, it's hard trying to ring them to get up out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning to go for a run. You see, with them being teenagers, their attention tends to go. We were the same, Bash. I was the same. 17, 18-year-old, if I had the chance of going out on Friday night and having a line Saturday morning, I'd have took that opportunity. So what happened was when they were younger, I coached them up to the nationals and they boxed really well. All 3, 4 of them I coached. And then unfortunately, friends going to college, here, there, driving about, it takes over. But my oldest nephew, he actually joined the army and he's the British middleweight army champion. So what he learnt in his teenage years, he then obviously got married and he lost a bit of interest. But then when he went back when he joined the army, he started boxing again. And last year he became the middleweight champion of the British Army. It's like riding a bike, Bash. Once you learn how to jab, all you need to do is polish it up and then you're back in again. Just work on your fitness. And I just wished that they would have stuck at it, and I think they would have done really well. But you can't force them to do what they don't want to do, Bash.
Yeah.
It's whichever sport you're in, you've got to have a passion for it. You've got to be able to sacrifice your friends, sacrifice going out, sacrifice the late nights. It's not easy. And I say to all the youngsters, if you can sacrifice that in your teenage years, or maybe sacrifice it in your adult years, you will pick up the rewards for it later on in life if you do succeed.
Yeah, no, I can't argue with that.
Yeah, no, I just want to go back to the question which you asked earlier. When Misam asked me, who was my favorite fighter of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. What it is, this is for Misam, by the way, if you're listening. What it is, I always look, when I look at a boxer, the sport itself, you look at boxing, Bash, people call it a sport. It's actually an art. It's the art of boxing. It's not a sport, it's the art of boxing. And like all arts, you have performers. So when these boxers come in the ring and apply their trade, they become performers of the art of boxing. Now, there's a difference between performing an art and mastering an art. Okay? When you master an art, you have to master every single element of that sport. Every single inch you've got to master. When you look at the ring, I always say you look at the ring. To an average boxer, it'll be a small ring. But for a great fighter, it'll be a continent. A continent which he is going to explore every single inch. Now, when I put my favorite fighters and I say that who was the great and who was the best, I put them into 3 categories, Bash. You've got world. Let's leave aside domestic and European. You've got world level, you've got elite level, and then you got the greats. Okay? Now, all boxers will compete at world and elite level. But when you make that jump, the jump from elite to great is massive. It's like jumping for the heavens. Okay? So I will always put my fighters in world, elite, and great. 60s. I know it was nearing the end of Sugar Ray Robinson's career. I think it was 65 or something when Robinson laced off his gloves and said, that's it. I think it was 65 if I remember correctly. 60s, Sugar Ray Robinson. Yeah? For me. Why? Because he made that jump from elite to greatness. So he was the greatest fighter in the 40s, 50s, and the 60s. I don't care how old he was. Now then, when I mentioned the jump from elite to great, it's like jumping up for the heavens. 70s, Muhammad Ali. 74, when Muhammad Ali made that ring walk to go and fight George Foreman, he was an elite fighter. When he walked out of that ring, he became a great. Not because he beat George Foreman. No, no, no. It's the way he did it. He relied on something other than his speed, his reflexes, because they'd gone. So what did he rely on? He relied on heart alone. It's said that after that fight, Bash, Muhammad Ali urinated blood for 2 weeks. That's how much pain he went through to beat George Foreman. Nowadays, you got a kid who hurts his eye socket. He wants to give up. You've got one who hurts his big toe. Oh no, I've had enough. No, that's the difference between greatness and world and elite. Okay, so 70s, at the end of the day, I'm going to go Muhammad Ali. Now in the 80s, I know he came late on. You've got fighters in the 80s who I love. You've got the likes of, you've got the Fab Four. You've got Hagler, Hearns. You've got Leonard. You've got Duran. Who do you pick? Yeah. At the end of the day, then you got Mike Tyson, who came towards late 80s. Do you know what I mean? Who can I pick out of the 80s? I couldn't tell you, but all I'm going to say to you before I go is that in the history of boxing, this is a massive statement. In the history of boxing, I can only think of 4 great fighters, because the word great is loosely used in the sport these days. Or the great Evander Holyfield, the great Larry Holmes. Elite fighters, yes, but not greats. Only 4. First being Jack Johnson.
Yeah, 100%.
He was the first black heavyweight champion. I did my dissertation on him when I did my degree at university, and I could not stop writing about this guy, the life he led, what he went through. Second, Joe Louis. Third, Muhammad Ali. And fourth, the greatest, Sugar Ray Robinson. Them are my 4 greats of all time. And so you got, Meesum's got his answer. He's got Robinson 60s, 70s. Obviously, you have to go with Muhammad Ali. But 80s, I don't know who to choose from the 80s. But I'm a big Marvin Hagler fan. So I'm going to go Marvelous Marvin Hagler for the 80s.
Good answer. And if anybody gets an opportunity or likes a bit of reading, gotta read up on Jack Johnson, man. Oof, what a life he had, man. It deals with a lot of other issues that are outside of boxing as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know, with Jack Johnson, Bash, he was a boxer who, he didn't just fight his opponents, he fought the establishment.
Yeah.
And I will tell you a little quick story about Jack Johnson. If you can imagine, we're talking the early 90s, and the blacks were slaves were still going. You've got a black man dressed up in a bowler hat, black suit, looking sharp. He's got his cane, and he's driving a car.
Yeah.
A story, this is in his autobiography. He's actually driving down the road, and a policeman stops him. Racism was, it was everywhere in them days. He called him a black so-and-so. He said, right, I'm going to charge you $50 because he's speeding down this road. Now, $50 in them days was a lot of money. You should have probably fined him $4 or $5. But because Jack Johnson was black, the policeman says $50. Jack Johnson pulls out $100 bill and says, there you go. And the policeman says to him, what about your change? He said, keep it, because I'm coming back the same speed when I come back on this road. So you might as well keep that 50. That's the kind of character Jack Johnson was. He fought. Great fighter, you're right. And also, you mentioned reading up on him. You can watch a documentary on him. It's called Unforgivable Blackness. It's on YouTube, and I really recommend people to watch that to get a rough idea about the history of the sport and how the sport evolved. Because when the blacks came into the sport evolved. Before, nobody would fight black people. They had the colour line. But when they started introducing the black people in, they brought their own sort of different style of fighting. They brought their own sort of hunger into the sport. So definitely worth the watch.
Brilliant. And I have actually kept you ahead and over your time limit, and I do apologize because I know you said you had to do something.
No. It's been a pleasure, Bash.
Without sounding rude, I think we are gonna call it a day at this one. But I do wanna obviously just give you an opportunity. Is there anything else that you want to say, or anything that you maybe want to talk about?
I just want to say there'll be a lot of people, watching this podcast from my hometown in Nelson. I just want to say, if I haven't seen you for years, and if I did ever upset you in any way, I find it in your heart to forgive me, man, because I'm a changed guy. I know a lot of people say I was like this, I was like that when I was younger, but I've always had a good heart, and I sincerely apologize to anybody who I haven't seen for years. Because sometimes you come to Nelson, you don't see people, but Nelson's in the heart. You know, it's where my mother taught me how to walk. It's where my father taught me how to be a man, and it's where I made some lifelong friends. And Nelson is always in the heart, man. And so are all my brothers and sisters in Nelson.
That is a very nice way to end things today. So again, I want to say thank you very much for taking out your limited and precious time, and also apologies for all the technical gremlins at the start. That was my fault. So
Don't mention it. Don't mention it, Bash.
1 second.
It's been great. It's been a pleasure, man. And give my salam to
Yeah,
everybody, yeah?
definitely will do.